to start out with who is, in my opinion, the best free agent still left, Jadeveon Clowney. He is a very interesting player because he's definitely a disappointment for being the number one overall pick. And with that said, though, he's still a very solid player that was on pace to be 45th out of all edge players in pressures, which is out of 129 players. So he's a very solid pass rusher, and he really adds a lot of value as a run defender as well because he's elite in that regard. So, with that said, I think Chicago would make the most sense for him because they have the most money in the NFL, and they were worst in weighted defensive value over average. They were also worst in pressure, according to PFF, and second worst in run defense, according to PFF as well. So they definitely need help on the defensive line. They added Walker as a sort of tweener, as an edge and defensive lineman, but they need more than that. And Clowney could really fill the void that they have on the defensive line because, as I said, he's a solid pass rusher, but he's also really good in run defense, so he's going to shore up that run defense pretty single-handedly. When healthy, the best offensive lineman left in free agency is Taylor Lewan, who hasn't been healthy 2 out of the last 3 years, but was healthy in 2021, and he put together a really solid year because, according to PFF grades, he had a 71 pass blocking grade and a 65 run blocking grade, which translates to a very solid year in pass protection and a solid one as a run blocker as well. So Lawan is very solid. His only real issue is that he hasn't been healthy recently, but when he is healthy, he's very good and still a pretty high-end tackle. I think he has positional versatility as well because he's only played left tackle in the pros, but he could be a right tackle because he's a really solid run blocker as discussed. And that just to me is somebody I want to take a swing on, and a place I think that would make good sense for him is the Jets because they were 4th worst in pass blocking this past year according to PFF, and they were 6th worst in run blocking, so they need help basically every way you slice it on the offensive line. And Dwayne Brown is a solid option as a pass protector, but he's really weak in the run game. So if Mekhi Becton stays injured, you're going to have a weakness in the run blocking with Brown, but that's going to be mitigated a bit by having Lawan, who's proficient in that regard. Or if Becton is healthy, and so too is Lawan, they've hit the lottery. They have solid bookend tackles at that point, so it's definitely a case where I would take a swing on the lottery ticket and hope that things end up going your way, because if they do for the Jets, the offensive line goes from a weakness to a possible strength. Scheme-wise as well, it makes a ton of sense for the Jets because Lawan is a very mobile offensive lineman at 310 pounds, and the Jets are going to be running a lot of Packers-influenced offense, so they're going to be running a lot of wide zone, which requires the offensive lineman to get downfield pretty quickly, and that's something Lawan can definitely provide. A move I think would make a ton of sense is Matt Ioannidis to the Browns, because Ioannidis was 20th among all defensive tackles in pressures last season, so he can really get after the quarterback. And his only issue is he's an okay run defender, but he really can struggle if he's getting double teamed because he's a bit undersized at about 305 pounds for a defensive tackle, which is not an issue for the Browns because Dalvin Tomlinson is an elite defensive tackle and is 325 pounds, so he's going to be getting doubled most of the time, and he can handle his own in situations like that. But with Tomlinson and Ioannidis on the interior, you have a real pass rushing spark to this team that is already pretty good as far as pass rushing goes with Myles Garrett and Zadarius Smith, and then Okoronkwo as well. So you just add to his strength and make it that the interior is not so much of a weakness, because Ionitis can switch in and out. On early downs, he can be a good pass rusher. On third downs, he can be a solid pass rusher as well. But if you want to put Zadarius Smith in as the defensive tackle and give Ionitis a break, that's more than fine. If you want to give Tomlinson a break with Ionitis on those third downs, that's also fine. So I think it's really nice. It allows for an interchangeability of defensive tackles, which right now just does not exist for the Browns, because Dalvin Tomlinson is the only defensive tackle I feel secure in for them. And you really need more than one, even if you have, I guess, 1.5 with Zadarius Smith being a capable defensive tackle as well. He's just not going to be able to play that the entire time, because he is, at the end of the day, more of an edge rusher and more of an undersized defensive tackle when he moves inside. So I think Ionitis makes a ton of sense for the Browns, and they have shown that they're not really afraid of being too undersized, because they have some undersized linebackers as is, and on the interior for defensive tackle, we're talking Jordan Elliott as their other defensive tackle, who's 305 pounds. So it's not like you're going from being a big, burly defensive line to being undersized. You're going from being undersized and pretty poor in talent with Jordan Elliott to being undersized and really skilled with Ionitis. An underrated free agent is Bryce Callahan, who is still a really solid nickel corner. And in the past 3 years, he's averaged a nice 69 PFF grade, which has him ranked as the 43rd best corner out of 136 that played 20% or more of last year's snaps. So he's really solid, and he is really nice because he can do it as a man coverage corner or as a zone cover guy. So he's really kind of agnostic as to where he ends up, and that's super nice, because a team that really is going to use him in both facets, man and zone, is Baltimore. And I think they would make a ton of sense, because there they have Brandon Stevens, who is not a very good corner, and overall the Ravens are a pretty solid coverage unit. They're a little above average, but they do have that big weakness at nickel corner, and Callahan would fit in so perfectly, as they could get him probably on a 1-year deal for super cheap, and he would immediately upgrade the position and make it to where there's no really easy targets for opposing offenses. And again, with Baltimore, they don't have to break the bank. They don't have a ton of money, so that's nice to be able to get a low-cost addition that's really going to make a difference on the defense. The best safety still in free agency is very solid, and also his parents must have hated him by the name they gave him. John Johnson is a bit of a meme. John Johnson, once again, crazy name. He is a super good player that I think basically never gets credit, because he's just not very flashy, but what he does immediately has impacts for defenses, as he is equally solid in man coverage as he is zone coverage. So if he goes to a team that blitzes a lot, he can accommodate that with good man coverage. If he goes to a team that's a little more conservative, like the Browns were with him last year, he can play zone coverage really well. He's also good deep in coverage, and he's solid enough of a run defender that he can play the shallow zones as well and be a good run defender also. So he's really nice. He can fit in basically anywhere. And a place I would really like to see him is in Green Bay, because one, he matches up with their timeline, meaning he is also very young. The rest of the Packers team is super young as well. And two, Darnell Savage has really struggled in recent years, and it just seems like he hasn't figured out the super conservative defenses that the Joe Barrys of the world are running. So if you had John Johnson, who has had success playing in a similar defense with Joe Woods, I think you immediately improve the defensive back core, and you're probably doing it for a fair amount cheaper than Savage will be, because John Johnson, you're getting late in free agency, and you're not expecting a whole lot because most teams have already passed over him. But again, he's a still very solid player that just is not the most flashy, so it can go underrated. I think it would be a really good addition for the Packers, though, because I think it would be a pretty clear upgrade from Savage, who just hasn't been very good recently. And it allows more versatility because, again, Johnson can play close to the line of scrimmage. He can play deep downfield. He can do anything. And that's something that Savage just is not equipped to do. One of the more interesting free agents still on the market is Kyle Van Noy. And what really sets him apart from other players is the fact that he can legitimately start as an edge rusher, but he can also play linebacker just fine as well. And that's a unique skill set that I think particularly lends itself well to the New York Giants, because with Wink Martindale being their defensive coordinator, they love to bring the heat. And that is something that applies to linebackers. And then with Van Noy being proficient as the edge rusher and linebacker, he's going to be able to come on blitzes, but he's also going to be able to defend the short middle part of the field, which can be easily attacked in blitzes when he's not going after the quarterback. So he can really fill in a void for the Giants right now, because currently the linebacking room for the Giants is a pretty big issue, I would say. I would say it's probably their biggest weakness out of any of their positional groups. So having Van Noy as that veteran leader that you know is going to be sound at multiple things is very good, especially because Bobby Okereke, their other linebacker, he's very solid, but he's not much of a pass rusher. So it gives you a dynamic that you just don't really have. And it also makes it that Gerard Davis is not going to have to get more time than he probably is worth, because Davis has just shown himself to not be a very sound player, and right now he would be their linebacker number 2. So I really like Van Noy to the Giants. I think he gives you so much value in being able to be somebody you can freely blitz or just leave in coverage. And also on pass rushing downs, he could be that third edge rusher as well. Thibodeau is big enough to be an undersized defensive tackle on clear passing downs, so he could move inside, and Van Noy could be an extra edge rusher, and they could do an ode to the Super Bowl winning Giants teams of years past and have multiple defensive ends on pass rushing downs, which can really cause havoc on passing situations. So there's a lot of value in Van Noy for not a ton of money. Another very solid edge rusher still on the market is Yannick Ngakoue, who was 36th out of all edge rushers in pressures last year, even though he missed 2 games. So he can still get after the quarterback. He's a very weak run defender, one of the absolute worst in the NFL. So he's pretty much just going to be used on third downs. But that still has a lot of value. And I think a good landing spot for him would be Chicago, because they were dead last in pressuring the quarterback, according to PFF. So he could really help change the tide there. And with my other addition to them, they could really fix their defensive line with just street free agents. So that could be something that really bolsters their defense and changes the complexion of their team as a whole for this entire season. This next one's a little bit of a hot take because he may just be washed at this point, but Quintorris Jones, otherwise known as Julio Jones, is somebody I would take one last flyer on, because though his yards per reception have gone down by about a yard each year in the past 2 years, he's still ranked 43rd in yards per reception, and that's good. What isn't so good, though, is the fact that he was on pace for 510 yards this past season. So, depending on how you want to look at it, he's either completely washed or still has something left in the tank. And I'm happen to believe that there is some merit to the yards per reception because he is really still efficient in the times he does catch the ball. So I think a good landing spot for him would be Green Bay because there, outside of Christian Watson, there's nobody you can really feel confident in as a true weapon for them. They added Jaden Reed as a nice second round addition. Romeo Dobbs, he could be something, but these are unknowns. Watson is the only one you can really feel confident in as being a legit receiver for the Packers. And I think that's where Julio makes a ton of sense because he gives you a sort of increased floor where even though he's not looking like a world beater in the past few years, he's still an NFL caliber receiver, and there's still upside associated with him because if he can be at full health and keep that yards per reception, but also be a little bit more productive on a game to game basis, he could be something. And worst case scenario, you have a good mentor for Christian Watson who is a similar athlete to what Julio was when he was younger. So Julio could definitely teach him a thing or two. Same thing for Dobbs. Dobbs is not nearly as athletic as Julio was, but he's 6'2". Julio is, I believe, 6'3". So he can teach him about body control and things of that nature, which, yeah, I don't typically buy into that you need players to teach other players. You have coaches that are able to do that. But really, what's the downside in having multiple players, or multiple people rather, that can instill good behaviors on other players? I think that's the key to success ultimately, is making sure everybody's on board with teaching the younger players. And right now, the Packers have a ton of youth on their team, so it could be a good veteran presence to have for the Packers.